Okay, kia ora koutou. My name is Andrew Gormley. I'm the science team leader of the Wildlife Ecology and Management team at the Bioeconomy Science Institute, so formerly Manaaki Whenua Landcare Research. We've merged with what was formerly Plant and Food and Ag Research and Science to form the Bioeconomy Science Institute. We'd just like to extend a warm welcome to everyone who has joined us today for our Biosecurity Bonanza webinar. Our presenters today are Amy Whitehead, who's a quantitative ecologist, and Laureline Rossignaud, who's a forest ecologist from the Bioeconomy Science Institute. Their talk is around browsing impacts of tahr on native alpine vegetation. Before they get underway, a couple of notes. As with all our webinars, we encourage interaction and questions. Please put these in the Q&A function rather than the chat function, and then we can get to those at the end. We'll answer as many of those as possible, but all questions will get transcribed and answered and shared post-webinar. If you want to see the speakers as well as the slides, I think there is the option of clicking the pop-out button at the top. If you're comfortable with doing that. Otherwise, I will now hand over to Amy and Laureline to give their presentation. Thank you very much.
Kia ora, Andrew. Thank you very much for that warm welcome. My name's Amy Whitehead, and as Andrew said, I'm a quantitative scientist here at the Bioeconomy Science Institute. And Laureline and I today are going to talk about Himalayan tahr within the alpine zone based on a long-term 30-year data set of monitoring. I want to acknowledge Sarah Richardson from the BSI, one of our collaborators, and as well as Ingrid and Ciel from the Department of Conservation, who have been involved with this work right from the very start. As many of you will be aware, we have a large number of browsing herbivores that have been introduced into New Zealand since European arrival. And many of these were introduced for both food and recreational hunting purposes. And you can see, a range of those across the bottom. We have 7 different deer species, goats, tahr, pigs, wallabies, rabbits, hares. And so many of those species are valued by many communities as a resource for hunting and for food security. They're important both socially and culturally. But there's wide recognition that they cause significant damage to both our native ecosystems and also our productive landscapes, browsing on pasture and production forestry. There's also an understanding that many of these species are now overabundant within our landscapes, and there's a need for effective landscape scale control across quite wide areas. And in order to do that, we need an understanding of the impacts that these herbivores are having across these landscapes. We need good information or good tools for effective surveillance and management, and then kind of a spatially coordinated approach to management that supports these multiple values that we have for these species across the landscape. So a lot of the work that we do here at the Bioeconomy Science Institute is kind of trying to unpack some of these issues. And the project that we're going to talk today about in relation to tahr addresses a number of these factors. Alpine tussock grasslands in New Zealand are a really unique ecosystem. They're quite widespread, particularly through the Southern Alps of New Zealand, but also in the North Island. But they have a very high diversity of plant species, and this is really makes them quite unique. These ecosystems are also home to a number of introduced herbivore species, particularly tahr in the central area of the Southern Alps, there up in the high elevation areas, but also deer, chamois, and hares. Now, these species can have quite significant impacts on our alpine ecosystems. A lot of those plants are particularly palatable to species. Tahr, who are effectively a goat, will eat almost anything. So there can be quite pervasive impacts in these systems. Now, tussocks are quite a dominant plant species within these alpine ecosystems, and they've been used historically for a number of monitoring programs as a proxy to assess the impacts of herbivores in these environments. They're highly palatable to both deer and tahr, as well as hares, and because these species will browse the tussocks down quite hard, a little bit like mowing the lawn, you can use tussock height as a proxy for understanding the impacts of herbivores in these spaces. Now, Himalayan tahr have been in New Zealand for quite a long time. They were first introduced in the Mount Cook region in 1904 for hunting, and then sort of multiple introductions since then in that central region of the Southern Alps. When they were initially released, there was a moratorium on hunting to allow those populations to establish. But by the 1930s, that legal protection was removed because it was quite clear that they were having significant impacts on the vegetation within these ecosystems. So hunting was allowed from 1930 onwards. And then in the 1970s, with the advent of helicopter hunting, you're probably pretty familiar with the venison recovery commercial work for deer, but this was also occurring for tahr. And in just a short period, just 11 years, it's thought that around 90% of the tahr within their range were removed through this helicopter hunting. And there was quite widespread concern from the recreational hunting groups that this could lead to the elimination of tahr across their range. So there was a commercial moratorium put in place in 1983 that banned commercial hunting, but recreational hunting was still allowed. In 1993, the Department of Conservation released the Himalayan tahr control plan. This was a document that was set out to guide the management of tahr throughout their range. And so this the Himalayan tahr control plan was set out in a way to guide management. It had set a maximum number of tahr within the feral range, which is the black, the area in the map outlined in black on the right-hand side. So this had a total cap of 10,000 animals within that feral range and harvest targets of around 2,000 animals to be removed per year. Now, management was also sort of varied spatially across this feral range with 7 different management units, and those are sort of identified by the different colours across the map. Within those management units, there were different management objectives and intervention densities that were set alongside these. So these were kind of the maximum number of animals that were allowed to occur within these management units, with control having to be put in place once those intervention densities were exceeded. And so in terms of the national parks, this was less than 1 animal per square kilometre, and then the other management units, the intervention densities are up to 2.5 tahr per square kilometre. There's also a couple of exclusion zones both at the northern and southern range where there's density targets of 0 animals per square kilometre, and that's to provide buffers to prevent the spread of animals either north or south. The Himalayan tahr control plan also set out a requirement for annual plans to guide control operations. The idea was that recreational and commercially guided hunting would do the bulk of the management within these management areas, with DOC stepping in to do additional control when required underneath the specifications of the plan. Now, the plan was set up to manage tahr to be in an ecologically acceptable state. This wasn't actually defined, so it's been a little bit open to interpretation. But in 1990, they established impact monitoring within these management units to assess the efficacy of the management that was being undertaken, and to try and understand what impacts both tahr were having in these catchments, but also how effective that management was. And so the work we're going to talk about today is based on this long-term impact monitoring. So there's 117 plots were established in the early 1990s across 8 study catchments. So we have our management units, and within some of those management units, 8 catchments with clustered sets of plots. And each plot was basically a grid that's permanently marked, and the plots were set up to be of sufficient size that they included 20 tussocks. So some of them just were quite small, depending on how densely populated the tussocks were. Within the plots, in terms of vegetation, the height and condition of tussocks was measured, as well as vegetation and composition and cover. So basically what species are present and how much of them are there. And this gives us an understanding of kind of the ecosystems and potential change over time. In terms of the herbivores, there was a couple of different measures. The first one is pellet counts for relative activity. So this gives us an indication of how many animals could be there. And this was done for both hares, who are quite common, particularly in the eastern parts of these catchments, and also ungulates. Now, I say ungulates because it's very difficult to distinguish between the fecal pellets of tahr, deer and chamois, who are also in these catchments, but it's thought that the dominant species is going to be tahr within the places that were monitored. And then they also undertook counts of tahr to estimate densities to compare against those intervention densities that I talked about. This was done using a range of methods over time, but as I say, gives us an indication of how many animals are present in the area. So the key questions that DOC have been interested in interrogating from this data set is, firstly, are hares and tahr showing similar population trends over time? You know, are we seeing increasing populations or decreasing in response to management of tahr? Have the patterns of alpine vegetation changed over time? Are we starting to see recovery in response to that management of tahr, or is something else going on? And then can we link, as I say, the vegetation changes to what's happening with those tahr and hare populations? And then finally, what does this mean for tahr management? You know, how effective has it been to date, and what might we need to change going forward if it turns out it's not as effective as we had been hoping? So these are the 4 questions that we're going to try and address today. So jumping to herbivore activity, there's a lot going on in this plot, so I'll just spend a little bit of time explaining what's happening. We've got on the x-axis along the bottom, we have time from 1993 to 2023, which was the most recent measurement. The y-axis represents herbivore activity. So in this case, we're looking at hares. Effectively, if you're at 0, it means there was no hare pellets found in any of the plots. And if you're at 1, then every single plot will have had hare pellets. So it gives you an indication of the relative activity of hares. And then each of the little panels represents 8 catchments. You don't need to worry too much about the detail here, but what we can see is that in a couple of catchments, we've had declines in hare activity over time, and in a couple of other ones, we've seen an increase. So there's no consistent pattern across these catchments in hare activity. In contrast, if we look at the ungulates, and again, remembering this we think is predominantly tahr, but could also be influenced by deer or chamois numbers, we see a significant increase in ungulate activity across 6 of those 8 catchments. And in some of those, they're quite significant increases over time. But an important thing to note here is that we don't see a relationship between hares and tahr, hares and ungulates across time. There's a couple of catchments where they're both going up, but in general, they're showing quite different patterns. And this can be helpful for how we interpret the vegetation data. In terms of changes in tahr density, so this is the number of tahr that we see in the landscape. As I mentioned, the methods of counting tahr have changed over time, and this does complicate our ability to interpret these results. So we just have to put that caveat out there. Initially, tahr were counted by people standing on the side of a hill with binoculars, recording the number of animals they could see. They've also been counted by counting carcasses during hunting operations, and then more recently using helicopter surveys. So the detection probabilities using those different methods are going to vary somewhat. But what we have in this plot on the right, again, we've got time on the x-axis and the number of tahr per square kilometre on the y-axis for each of the 8 catchments. And you can see that in a couple of catchments, we've seen decreases in tahr over time, but in one there has been a small increase. So again, not a consistent pattern in tahr density. Now, what you might be able to see if you squint along the bottom, there's some horizontal dotted lines, and those represent the intervention densities for each of our catchments of interest. And the take-home message really from this is that currently all catchments exceed those intervention densities based on the data that we have to date. So that looks like that there's more work to do in this space. I'm now going to hand over to Laureline to talk you through the vegetation data.
Thanks, Amy. Kia ora, everyone. So, like Amy presented a little bit earlier, here we decided to focus on the tussock height. That is a good proxy usually to assess the impact of ungulates activity. And when we looked at the overtime trends, which is the graph that is sitting on your left, hopefully, we found that across all the catchment, tussock height has been declining over time, and this pattern was found across most of the catchment. And when trying to identify whether there was a relationship with a change in ungulate activity, we saw that tussock height is declining with increase in ungulate activity. However, when focusing on hair, we found no relationship. So when another way of assessing potential impact of ungulate activity is to look at vegetation cover. Here we focused on the overall vegetation cover, which is based on the Ricci method. So we are not distinguishing between the different plant species within that community. And what we found is that overall, we had an increase in vegetation cover over time. And there was no relationship with ungulate activity, which may suggest some sort of recovery from the overall alpine vegetation. However, that pattern was not found across all the catchment. So when we line up all the results on the ungulate activity and the hair activity and other measures of tahr, we found different patterns based on the species and the way they were measuring. But what we found is that ungulate activity has been increasing across most of the catchment to various degrees. And when we line them up with the vegetation, we saw that tussock height has been declining across most of the catchment. Also with various degrees. For instance, in the Zohar catchment, within 20 years, we went from a tussock height of 54 centimeters to a mean of 16 centimeters, which is quite drastic. And that can be aligned with the increase in hair and ungulate activity. Interestingly, the overall increase in vegetation cover was mostly driven by a subset of catchment, like North Branch, Thompson, and Soha. And although when we look at the overall pattern, we think that there might be some recovery from our analysis on tussock height, we can definitely say that this is not thanks to tussock, and this might be these increased patterns might be related to other plant species that might be less palatable to ungulates, which are taking advantage of a decline in tussock cover, potentially. So overall, in summary, we found that ungulate activity has increased while hair activity is more variable across the catchment. Tussock height has been declining across most of the catchment, and this is probably associated with the increase in ungulate activity. However, vegetation cover, I showed different patterns that suggest some sort of recovery and no relationship with herbivore activity. However, when we consider the patterns found in tussocks, we could think that there might be an indirect impact of herbivores with favoring some other plant species that are maybe less palatable. And tahr density currently exceed intervention density, unfortunately, which negatively impact alpine vegetation community, especially which are supposed to be the dominant species in those alpine ecosystems.
So I'm just going to wrap it up with talking about some of the implications for management based on this work. As Laureline just said, it's clear that we need to do ongoing tahr control within these catchments to meet those management targets, the intervention densities and the total population cap that is set under the Himalayan tahr control plan, and DOC and others are actively working in this space. But there's also a need to understand how other parts of the alpine ecosystem are responding. We've talked, a lot about tussocks today, but as Laureline said, it looks like there are changes in other parts of those alpine ecosystem plant communities, and that's a piece of work that we are currently undertaking for DOC at the moment, looking at how some of those other species are changing, both in space and time within those plots. And as Laureline said, it might be that some of the palatable species are dropping out, and the less palatable species are sort of replacing those. But that's a work in progress, and we will report back at some time in the future when we've undertaken that piece of work. I think this piece of work really shows the value of this type of long-term monitoring. It's really been really valuable to kind of understand how both the plant communities and the animal communities have changed over time within these ecosystems. And I really, applaud those that had the foresight to set this up back in 1990 and have managed to carry it on through, what is often a challenging funding things. So it's really great to have this, and I'd love to see this occurring in more places where we can to really capture the value of this type of work. I think it's also an interesting case of kind of highlighting the importance of spatially explicit management for browsers. And what I mean by this is that within the tahr program, they have these different management units which have different objectives for how they are managed and what we are managing for. And that seems to work quite well. And given the kind of socially complex space that we have with browsers, it would be really nice if we can kind of use this approach to try and look at how we manage browsers more broadly across the landscape in New Zealand. And finally, I just want to really acknowledge the work of DOC and the key stakeholders involved in this managing tahr in this space. As I say, it is a socially complex space where people, depending on the hat that you're wearing on a day, will have different values and objectives for what they'd like to see in the landscape. But the tahr plan implementation liaison group are a group of key stakeholders who have been working really hard to get around the table and get this management system working. So just want to shout out to those guys for the great work that they're doing in this space. That's it from us today. Thank you very much for joining us, and I will hand it back to Andrew to close.
Fantastic. Thank you very much to both Amy and Laureline for the presentation. Really excellent. We've got quite a few minutes for questions. So if you've got any, you can, like I said at the start, please put those in the Q&A section. Whilst we're waiting for a couple to come through, I guess there's a question, Amy and Laureline, around the patch. Well, I don't know a lot about tahr, but they're patchy sort of distribution. They're not sort of evenly spread across those management units, and how that might mitigate or make worse some of those potential impacts that they're having at a smaller scale.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, Andrew. As you say, tahr are quite patchy in how they use space. You might have seen in one of those photographs a big mob of young juvenile male tahr hanging out together a little bit like kind of rowdy teenagers. Those guys at certain times of the year will move around together. The nannies and their kids will also often mob up and use space quite patchily, where they hang out quite low in the landscape at night, and then will move up to feed during the day. So there's quite variable kind of use of space. As I mentioned earlier too, they're also basically will eat anything, and they're not very fussy. So they will set up camps in places and browse that particular patch really hard down, and then sitting next door will be exactly the same kind of vegetation or something even tastier, and they won't move over there. So that kind of complicates the picture of how well we can assess their impacts, because if our plot doesn't happen to fall in a place where tahr have been camping, then we might miss it, or we might be overestimating their impacts depending on, kind of how they're doing. So that makes it tricky. It also makes them tricky to manage as well, depending on where they are in the landscape.
Yep, nice. A question, is there a plan to calibrate the different monitoring methods, given comparing detection probabilities and the like, to make better use of that long-term data? And I guess, what would be the challenges to attempt to do that?
I mean, I think that's an excellent question, and it's something I really grappled with when I was trying to analyze that data. It would be really handy if we could do that. The kind of move, or the current method of monitoring is to monitor from helicopters, doing sort of aerial grids across the landscape and counting tahr that way. I think it's a really quick and easy way of monitoring across scale. But there are some fish hooks in there as well, particularly because tahr are, often hunted from helicopters. They're going to have avoidance behaviour whenever they hear a helicopter, so we're potentially going to hide under a bush or a rock. So they're a difficult species to monitor. Trail cameras in some contexts might be useful to understand some of that stuff. It would be really cool to put some radio trackers on, or GPS collars on some animals as well, and look at how they're using space. So there's definitely work that we could do in that space to try and tease some of that information out.
Another comment or question, great talk. What do you think is driving the differences in trends in ungulates across the density measures and activity measures? So, for example, most activity indices showed increases, but far fewer density estimates showed the same.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the challenges that we had as well in analysing that data, and it obviously complicates the picture. I think there's two things going on there potentially. One is that change in method from monitoring the density of tahr. So it could be that some of what we're seeing or not seeing in terms of trends is due to that change in method. The other thing that we find, if we plot the activity data, so the pellet data, against the tahr density data, there's almost no relationship. And that also complicates things. So, we assume that more poo means more animals, but that's not necessarily how it works. And particularly for tahr, who are very, as I said before, very patchy in how they use the landscape. If you've got a tahr camp that's set up in your plot, there's going to be a heap of poo that isn't necessarily related to the number of animals. So that's one of the challenges of using that kind of relative measure of activity.
Yep. Have there been any noticeable changes to plant species, change from leafy tussocks to woody shrubs, or?
So that's a very interesting question. We are actually slowly making our way to tackling that question. So it depends. It varies a lot between catchments, as they are not at the same elevation. So, for example, in the tussock catchment, the Townsend, catchment, we could see some increase in some of the woody species, such as Dracophyllum, but we are still on doing the analysis at the moment, so I can't say more about it. But yeah, there are definitely some variation in terms of which plant species, especially in terms of growth form, are taking over in terms of overall vegetation cover.
Another thing just to add to that is that some of those, particularly the really eastern catchments, have had some history of both fire and potentially pastoral activity with high country livestock in those catchments at some point. So there may be a natural successional process that's happening in some of those plots as well, where we're just seeing plots moving perhaps towards more woody or recovering from other disturbance. So that, again, complicates the picture of what's going on.
Have you any suggestions for how we could improve monitoring of alpine environments, especially given the rapid changes in some areas like glacial retreat or upslope adjustments of species?
So there has been a little bit of work that Doc has been looking at in terms of a more spatially spread monitoring program, particularly aimed at tahr. So that's sort of looking more broadly and across more different ecosystem types. But again, it's a plot-based method where you have to go out and measure all of the species that are there. Those methods take time. They're time-consuming. They're difficult landscapes to work in. So at the moment, that's probably the best that we have. The alpine environment is also captured under some of the tier 1 monitoring that Doc does as well, but they're difficult landscapes to work in. And so, I mean, if anyone's got any ideas on how we could improve that, I would be very happy to chat more about it.
That's fantastic. That's all the posted questions at the moment. So we will close off that for now. Thank you very much to both Amy and Laureline for sharing your research today. I don't know if you've got any final comments that you have for the audience.
I just, again, want to reiterate that kind of the value of these long-term data sets, that they're so useful for answering these types of questions. So let's see if we can, try and keep these going for as long as we can.
Yep. Okay, I thank you very much on behalf of the Bioeconomy Science Institute team. Thank you very much to you all for joining us today. Ka kite.
Ka kite.
Ka kite.